What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of The Coach's Quarters. I am your host, Jacob, and today we've got a slightly different show from our normal scheduled programming. Instead of covering the games that have happened in the previous week, the things that kind of went on and what the teams did, maybe right or wrong, today we are covering the trade deadline. This is one of my favorite days of the year. I live for the deadline. I think this is one of the most exciting days of the season for the NFL, and I have been waiting all day to cover all of the moves made. We had some good moves, we had some less than stellar moves, we had some pretty mid moves that were more for rotational players. Not a lot of movement this season, but there was movement to be had. Some teams got better, some teams initiated either a soft or a hard rebuild. And today I am covering it all for Trade Deadline Tuesday, baby. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Woo, noises. All right, let's get started. So, the first trade that I'm going to cover that happened today is the Cleveland Browns and the Detroit Lions. The Cleveland Browns traded Donovan Peoples Jones to the Detroit Lions for a sixth round 2025 selection. And, DPJ had a career year in 2022 with 61 catches for 839 yards and three touchdowns. His production kind of fell off after Cleveland acquired Elijah Moore from the New York Jets. He's only had 8 catches for 97 yards this year. And with the quarterback inconsistencies that the Browns have kind of fielded all season with Deshaun Watson's injury and having to bouts between DTR and PJ Walker, there really hasn't been that consistent thrower to really take advantage of Donovan Peoples-Jones. So he was moved to the Lions, and what was a rather good move for the Lions. I've seen a handful of pundits, maybe not necessarily like this move. Maybe they thought that the Lions should have gone after a bigger name. But Donovan Peoples-Jones is 6'2", and he's speedy, and he has rather reliable hands. So bringing him into this offense that is rather dynamic all in itself, that fields Amon-Ra St. Brown, Josh Reynolds, rookie Phenom Sam Laporta, second-year wideout Jamison Williams coming off of an injured rookie season and a 4-week gambling suspension that's kind of getting worked into the fold, an emerging rookie running back in Jahmyr Gibbs, and a star-studded David Montgomery who's been in and out with injuries, but still incredible at the position. The Lions have acquired a receiver that can really give them the depth that they need. And the way that Donovan Peoples-Jones plays football is very similar to the output of what Detroit thought Jamison Williams was going to bring to the offense in the first place. So bringing him in allows them to work Jamison Williams into the fold a little slower if need be, and it gives them the exact same production in terms of style that they were looking to get out of him anyways. You know, he averaged 15.7 yards per catch during his career with Cleveland, and he's really boomer bust is the wrong way to put it, but he has that capability to boom at any given time. So they can work him in the short, medium, or deep part of the field. He allows them a bigger target at 6'2" to target in the red zone if need be. And all in all, Detroit got away with a steal here for only a sixth rounder in the 2025 season. On the flip side, the Browns got very little, but they did get something for a receiver that wasn't already being used on their roster. He has an expiring contract, and it allows the Browns to, make another selection, albeit, next season as opposed to this upcoming draft. But it gives them a little draft capital for a wide receiver that was probably going to leave Cleveland in the first place. So the fact that they were able to flip him for something versus losing him for nothing is worth noting. Do I think that they got a little too little? Maybe. He was probably worth a sixth rounder in 2024. However, again, they still got something rather than nothing, and that in itself was good for the Browns. I do think that the Lions won this trade. Again, they got reliable depth they got reliable depth at their wide receiver core. He is not an old player by any means. I believe DPJ is, hold on, Chris, 24 years old. So he gives them somebody that if they choose to extend him, they give him a reliable receiver that they can have for probably very little money. And it allows for Detroit to be a little more versatile with what they do with their upcoming draft picks. So I think the Lions won this trade. The Browns didn't get much in return for him. And Donovan Peoples Jones gets to return to Detroit. He played college in Michigan. He grew up in Michigan. So they're bringing in a local kid to play for the pro team, and he should be able to contribute almost right away. So this was an interesting move for the Lions. I myself thought that they might have swung a little higher, but I like this trade for a depth trade at the very least. Up next, we have the Bills and the Packers. The Bills sent a 2024 third round pick to the Packers for Rasul Douglas and a 2024 fifth round pick. Rasul Douglas has 18 total solo tackles plus 4 assists and 6 passes defended this season with 1 interception. He has been targeted 34 times in coverage, allowing 274 yards and 4 touchdowns with a 109 passer rating to opposing quarterbacks. So Douglas joins a depleted Bills secondary that currently ranks 26th out of 32nd over the last 4 games. Overall, the Bills secondary does rank 10th overall in the league, so they were hurting, but they weren't hurting that bad in the secondary. However, Trey White tore his Achilles in season, or not in season. Trey White tore his Achilles in week 4. He is on IR for the rest of the season, and Rasul Douglas looks to be the number 1 perimeter defender, mixed in with Christian Benford, Kyrie Lamb, and Dane Jackson. So it looks like Rasul Douglas will probably be an immediate fit here. He provides it's a veteran presence that the Bills secondary was able to bring in for not next to nothing. It was a pretty high pick considering, the circumstances around Rasul Douglas. However, over, his career with the Packers, he's actually been relatively solid. Right? So they're bringing in a veteran presence to replace Trey White for the rest of this season while they make a bid for the AFC. And the Packers were able to get a third round pick to eventually, flesh out either their offense or their defense. They get a day 2 pick that is actually a rather coveted pick. So overall, this was a well-rounded trade. The Bills probably needed it more than the Packers. Rasul Douglas is on an expiring contract. He's getting a little older. He's dipped in the last couple of seasons. So being able to flip him for a day 2 pick was fantastic for the Packers. Good move by Gutekunst. And in the meantime, the Bills were able to kind of keep afloat. They needed a lot of defensive help. I couldn't believe that this was the only move that the Bills made. They have other holes created by all of these defensive injuries that they've fielded over the last couple of weeks. But still, this was a good trade for the Bills. He should be able to provide a more of a solid balance for their secondary. He is a good coverage corner. Despite the fact that his stats have dipped a little over the last couple of years, he's been a pretty reliable starter over, the course of his career. So this was a move that benefited both teams. Both teams came out. I would grade this trade rather equally. The trade was initially reported by Ian Rappaport, and it really gives both sides a step in the right direction moving into the future. On the heels of the Rasul Douglas trade, we have 2 trades by the Washington Commanders that I understood, but I didn't understand. The Commanders have been very up and down this season, to say the least. They have not been terrible. They also have not been great. Their defensive efficiency hasn't been all that good, but they traded both edge players. They traded both Montez Sweat and Chase Young. We're going to start with the Montez Sweat trade, and I'll work my way to the Chase Young trade. So Washington traded the Chicago Bears Montez Sweat for a 2024 second round pick. This was an interesting trade, to say the least. Chicago has a lot of holes, and they gave away a primo pick for a good edge rusher. Montez Sweat is very good at what he does. However, that he is in an expiring contract, and Chicago's defense is not good. So they're bringing Montez Sweat in, and it was just one of those things where it felt like as Chicago moves forward, this, for one, signifies that Justin Fields probably does not get re signed next season because they're going to have to break the bank for Montez Sweat if he doesn't walk in free agency. And they have to have some sort of a contingency plan in their back pocket because they're not good and everybody wants to win games. So they're either going to have to pay Montez Sweat an astronomical sum of money to stay, or, they lose him. So this ends up either being a dead trade for Chicago, or they have to overpay for a guy that they can hope really bolsters their defensive line moving forward. The Washington Brass was heavily involved in this deal. Moving Sweat freed around $6.5 million in future cap room and gave Washington 8 total picks in the upcoming draft, which is great for Washington. But they also lose their best defensive lineman so far this season that doesn't play on the interior defensive line. Sweat has had 21 solo tackles, six and a half. Sweat has had 21 solo. Sorry, Chris, I'll take a pause there. Sweat has had 21 solo tackles and 6.5 sacks so far in 2023 per ESPN. And he is joining a Chicago defense with the 32nd ranked NFL defensive line with 10 total sacks on the season. So he does provide that immediate help that Chicago may need. However, despite this little run of victories that Chicago has pulled off, it doesn't feel like this trade's going to impact their viability this season. This season almost feels lost for Chicago, and moving a second round pick for a defensive lineman that is he's in the last year of his contract, and they're gonna have to pony up a lot of money for him. This was a semi head scratcher for Chicago. Meanwhile, for Washington, they get a second round pick for Montez Sweat. They didn't want to pay him. Now they have an extra pick to go along with what is already a pretty decent carousel of picks. They'll be able to replace him with either a rookie or a free agent that maybe won't command quite the cap that Montez Sweat would have. So Washington probably wins this trade. I like Montez Sweat. I cannot emphasize that enough. He's a guy that I've traded for on Madden, right? Like, he's a good dude. He's a very good locker room presence. He's a very good football player. He's very good at rushing the passer. He's good in run defense. But I don't know if it's enough to really make a large splash for the Chicago defense that just has not been good, despite Matt Eberflus being touted as a good defensive coach. Next up, we have the Washington Commanders trading the San Francisco 49ers Chase Young for a 2024 third round pick. And before I get into any of the intricacies of this was a fleece. Chase Young has not played much or great in the last 2 seasons, courtesy of an injury. However, his rookie year, he was an absolute star. And this year, it has really looked like he has returned to form. And he has played very well for Washington this season. So now San Francisco sends a third round pick, which is a primo pick. But Chase Young was a very high first round pick when drafted and is now joining a defensive front with former teammate Nick Bosa, who was very excited for this trade. Eric Armstead, who has been good for San Francisco the whole time he's been there. Drake Jackson, Randy Gregory, whom they just acquired, Javon Hargrave, who is very, very good on the interior, and Javon Kinlaw, who is very versatile and who has had a very good season so far. So Chase Young is going to a star-studded San Francisco defense that was already pretty good and allows San Francisco to make that push for the NFC versus the Eagles there at the very end, or, whomever ends up being at the top. But this is going to give San Francisco just another top-tier weapon on their defense to make that final push. And just like the Montez Sweat trade, the Washington top brass was reportedly very involved in this move, per Adam Schefter. And it just feels like this is Washington moving into that rebuild phase, at least on their defense. They retained Jonathan Allen, they retained Daron Payne, and they've moved on from their edge rushers. They have a young offense, so it looks like this is more of a soft rebuild on the defensive side of the ball for Washington, whereas Chase Young, who has 15 total tackles this year and 5 total sacks this year, is going to San Francisco to try and compete for a ring, something that he was not going to be able to do in Washington. So I like this I like this trade for San Francisco. I feel like this was semi a fleece. I don't like that Washington sold both of their edge rushers. It felt like they probably could have retained at least one of them. They're slated to have like 90 something million dollars in cap space after this season. So moving on from both was a bit of a head scratcher, but it does feel like the trade with Chicago probably was a good move. I would have kept Chase Young if I were Washington. I am not involved in their top brass. I am not that important, right? But all in all, Washington probably gets better from this. They probably move on from Riverboat Ron after this season, and we probably see a little bit of a shakeup. Maybe we see Eric Bieniemy take over the head coaching role with Washington and bring him. He might bring in a decent defensive coordinator. I have no idea who he would go after, but he might bring in a DC that's able to use these picks in order to rebolster this defensive line that's been so good for so many years. So only the future will tell. I like the Chicago trade for Montez Sweat. I didn't like the Chase Young trade to San Francisco for Washington, but all in all, Washington did a pretty good job at the trade deadline. I mean, again, their defensive efficiencies have not been very good with both of these guys in the lineup. This gives them the ability to free up some of the younger guys and see kind of what they have more or less at their depth, so they really know what they need, and it allows San Francisco to make a stronger push for the Super Bowl. It allows Chicago to live in this fantasy land where they're going to win more games and potentially win a pretty weak division this season. And it's going to be very interesting to see how in the future these trades really impact the teams that were part of the trades in the first place. Moving on, we have the Seattle Seahawks and the New York Giants in a trade that I did actually like. It wasn't a universally heralded trade. However, I do like what ended up happening. I think the Seahawks traded a little too much. However, the Seahawks send over a 2024 second round pick and a 2025 fifth round pick for defensive lineman Leonard Williams from the Giants. Leonard Williams, previously with the Jets, was traded to the Giants, was given a 3-year contract. The Giants are going to eat a large portion of his contract in this trade. Um, and Williams has 13 solo tackles and 1.5 sacks this year on a Giants defense that has underperformed, to say the least. So the Seahawks were able to add a once very good defensive lineman, producing just a the Seahawks add a once very good defensive lineman to a D line, producing just a 21.1% pressure rate right after climbing to first in their division. Williams is a large body for defensive minded Pete Carroll to use in their bid for the postseason. Pete Carroll is notorious for being able to get the best out of their defensive players, almost at a Bill Belichickian level. So this was a good move for Seattle. He was a little expensive, like I said before, but his production will probably climb here in Seattle, where he has a more hospitable environment. Seattle's defense has not been terrible as a whole, and Leonard Williams probably will provide that boost that Seattle really wanted. Something that they were looking for a couple years back when they traded for Carlos Dunlap. That might have been last year, but either last year or the year before when they traded for Carlos Dunlap. This is kind of the same production that they're going to be looking for from Leonard Williams. He's a versatile defender, and it looks like something that Pete Carroll probably put his stamp on, really made the move for at the end of the day. And it gives Pete Carroll a guy that he can move around the defensive line, that can produce pressure on the quarterback, that can stop the run. It gives him an efficient player to work with on that defensive line, something that Seattle has really needed this season. And the fact that they are now first in their division, they're above the 49ers after their previous loss. Leonard Williams might really give Seattle that extra little edge to retain this division and possibly make a bid for the Super Bowl. Meanwhile, the Giants are entering a rebuild, which is more speculation on my part, but not really. If you're listening to this show, you watch the NFL and you've seen what the Giants have done this season. So speculation is a bit of, it's an understatement to say the least. But the Giants are entering a rebuild. We're able to get good compensation for a player that was declining in their scheme. Leonard Williams has kind of fallen off over the last year or two with the Giants, albeit probably because the Giants' defense hasn't been terrific, but still he hasn't lived up to the contract that they gave him, right? So the fact that the Giants haven't looked good this season, and they now after this trade have 4 picks projected to go in the top 70 for this upcoming draft, Leonard Williams was able to give the Giants another pick that they can use to bolster any position on their roster. They have so many holes that this gives them a little more leeway to kind of go in any direction that they want, and they have four shots at some of the quote unquote top players in the draft. You have steals at the back end, but your top 100 picks typically are the guys that make the rosters. They're typically the guys that are more instant producers. Was it a first rounder? No. But the fact that they were able to get a second round pick out of Seattle for a 30-year-old defensive lineman is impressive. This was a good move by a young Giants brass. This was a good move by Pete Carroll to make a bid for the postseason. And all in all, I like both sides of this trade. I don't think the Giants are going to miss Leonard Williams. This is another guy in an expiring contract. And I do think that they're going to be able to replicate his production that he's given out over the last year and a half rather easily in free agency or the draft. So the Giants win, Seattle wins. Like, this is a very, very much a draw in terms of, trade production. This trade was originally listed by Tom Pelissero. That's not the fucking word I'm looking for, Chris. This trade was originally announced by Tom Pelissero, and all in all, it feels like a good move on both sides. Moving forward, we have the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles actually made two trades that I'm going to talk about today. However, with this one, the Falcons send a conditional 2024 sixth round pick if he plays in 6 or more games this season to the Eagles for defensive tackle Contavious Street and a 2025 7th round pick. An underrated Atlanta defense gets a little depth help following star Grady Jarrett's ACL tear this past Sunday. Street is a very versatile defender that can line up inside or outside the defensive line and can produce sacks and pressure even in a rotational role. He has played in multiple positions along the defensive front and linebacker for the Eagles. He was very good for the Saints, and he gives Atlanta a rotational player that they can use to help, ease the burden of losing their star in Grady Jarrett to the ACL for the rest of this season. Meanwhile, the Eagles had incredible defensive front depth. They have Hassan Reddick, Fletcher Cox, Jalen Carter, Josh Sweat, Jordan Davis, Brandon Graham, and Derek Barnett. And they were able to move a guy with a 17% usage rate along the defensive line. He only has one start this season, and they were able to get a pick for him. Is it a great pick? No, but it is a pick this year. It's a late round pick, but it's something that Howie Roseman can grab somebody with any sort of use with. They didn't need him. He was an afterthought on this defense, more or less, and they have a lot of good young talent on this defensive line already. So this was a trade where Atlanta needed rotational depth following Grady Jarrett's injury. The Eagles didn't need the depth that they had. It was not a big trade. This was more of a splash, right? Just a small splash, a little blip on the radar. The Falcons were able to shore up a depth positional issue that they had following an injury. The Eagles were able to offload a player they didn't need for a pick. And this one, it's a draw. There's going to be a lot of that word used today, but it's a draw. This is something that's going to help the Falcons more than it's going to help the Eagles. I do think that Contavious Street's better than a 6th round pick. However, it's also one of those things where the Falcons were in need. There weren't a lot of people selling defensive linemen that weren't stars, right? Leonard Williams garnered a 2nd round pick. The Falcons are a young team. They're amidst a rebuild. They don't need to sell high, right? Like, they don't need to sell that 2nd round pick. So they were able to get a guy that's going to be able to come in and be an immediate contributor, almost maybe 1 or 2 weeks to learn the playbook. And then he'll be on a rotational role where he can help pressure the quarterback, get sacks, and help take a little bit of the pressure off of the other defenders on this Atlanta D line that are already playing above expectations. So this is going to be this is more of a futures pick for the Falcons, right? So I like Atlanta's defense this season. I think they are very underrated in terms of the league's defense. And I think that this was a very good move for Atlanta. If I were to grade this trade, I do think that the Falcons won this trade, But you can't really say that with the Eagles not needing him. Like he was wasting a roster spot for the Eagles, and he helped free up a spot for the trade that I will cover here in a little bit that the Eagles made. That was a much larger splash in the trade ocean. All right. This trade was initially reported by Ian Rappaport. Now, moving to that larger splash in the trade ocean, right? The Eagles trade safety Terrell Edmonds and a 2024 fifth and sixth round pick for the Titans All Pro Pro Bowl safety Kevin Byard. The Eagles were able to grab an All Pro. Oh, cut that part. That was just something. It was fucking wording that I had written down here. All right. So the Eagles were able to trade for an exceptional safety from the Titans in exchange for 2 3-day picks and a safety who is best in run support, something that is not helping the Eagles in what they are having trouble in. The Eagles got a plug and play upgrade for an 18th got a plug and play upgrade for an 18th ranked pass defense to bolster a squad at the top of the NFC, trying to make a push for a second consecutive Super Bowl run. The Titans also seem to be a talent farm for Philadelphia. Howie Roseman was able to. The Titans also seem to be a talent farm for Philly. Howie Roseman was able to acquire A.J. Brown from the Titans a season or two ago. And it just seems like every time that Howie calls the Titans, they should probably hang up the phone, right? It feels like every single trade is a fleece. I like this trade a lot for the Eagles. I do not like it for the Titans. This was, in fact, a fleece, and the Eagles were able to get significantly better. Kevin Byard is one of the top 5 coverage safeties in the league and has been for a good long while. But on the flip side, right, the Titans got younger at the safety position. It was a bit of an underwhelming return considering how good and consistent Kevin Byard has been for them. They did ask him to take a pay cut prior to this season. He declined. They restructured his contract. And this really seems to signify that the Titans are nearing a rebuild. Whether it be a soft rebuild or a hard rebuild, we have yet to see. Will Levis played admirably. They decided to retain Derrick Henry, so maybe this ends up being more of a soft rebuild, but a rebuild nonetheless. However, Edmonds, despite being a good safety, he's not Kevin Byard, right? Kevin Byard may have been expensive and aging a little bit, but again, Kevin Byard is one of the top 5 coverage safeties in the league. So having played in Tennessee for all 7 of his pro years and being a 3rd-round pick in 2016, Kevin Byard has done more than enough for the Titans to have gotten anything more, right? The fact that, again, Terrell Edmonds is good, but the fact that they were only able to get a 5th and a 6th-round pick out of the Eagles for Kevin is nuts. They should have at least been able to get, a 4th and a 6th, maybe a 3rd and a 7th. Like, it felt like he should have garnered more draft compensation than what the Titans were actually able to get for him. So with this one, I do think this was a fleece. I think the Eagles outright. I think the Eagles outright won this trade. I think the Titans didn't get enough in. I don't think the Titans got enough compensation for Kevin Byard. However, again, they got younger on the defense, and it does signify a soft rebuild at the least. So at least they were able to get a young safety back from the Eagles, a guy that has been pretty good. He's better in the box. He's better in run support. However, they did get a young safety to work out, and they did get 2 selections to make in this upcoming draft. So it could have been worse. It could have been much, much better, but it could have been worse. Next up, there are only 2 more trades that were made at the deadline. Again, there wasn't very much movement this season. So these last 2 trades involve the Minnesota Vikings. The first one that I'm going to cover is going to be the Vikings trade with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Vikings traded up-and-coming guard Ezra Cleveland to the Jaguars for a 2024 6th-round pick. And this one was a little wild to me considering the circumstances. However, Ezra has been sidelined with a foot injury the last 2 weeks, and he is on. Ezra Cleveland has been sidelined. No, I don't like that. Ezra's. God damn it, Chris. Yeah, it's getting late, dude. It started, the words are not coming out as easy as they were. Ezra has been sidelined with a foot injury for the last 2 weeks, but despite that, he's only allowed one sack in 2023. This was a good move for the Jaguars. He's under contract through 2024. He's played in the last 49 of 53 games for Minnesota, and he carries a PFF grade of 73.8, which, if you don't know, that's a pretty decent rating for a guard. Once he returns from this foot injury, it's likely that he's going to replace Tyler Shatley at guard, who's had a pretty rough 2023 so far and has a PFF grade of 46.5 currently. This was a good move for Jacksonville. I can't emphasize that enough. This immediately makes their interior offensive line better. As soon as Ezra comes back from this injury, they're going to be a lot better on the interior of their offensive line. They're going to be able to run a lot more. More is the wrong word for it, but a more versatile offense, right? He's going to be able to provide better pass blocking for Trevor Lawrence than Shatley has been able to give. He's going to be able to kick block a lot better than Shatley has for Travis Etienne. And overall, this was just a really good move. On the flip side of this, Minnesota moves on from a good starting guard who has not seen the field since week 6 with the foot injury, and whose backup Dalton Reisner was acquired in the offseason. Reisner has played well and will probably command a smaller contract extension after his contract is up, which is why I think they moved on from Ezra. Ezra is going to command a lot more money on the open market or just in contract extensions in general. So with Reisner playing as well as he has, he's filled the role admirably. He's going to be cheaper on the back end. So the Vikings felt that they were going to be able to move on from Ezra Cleveland despite him being much younger. It was one of those moves where Minnesota really felt like Dalton Reisner was going to be able to come in, give them a couple of good years at guard, and they weren't going to take that drop off on their offensive line that some people are projecting they might. I do believe it had a little bit to do with his foot injury. You know, maybe his foot's a little more injured than what's been given to the public. So Jacksonville might not see him for a little longer than what maybe we expect. However, he is a good guard. So the Vikings are betting pretty heavily on Dalton Reisner, who didn't command a lot of interest in free agency, to come in and replicate all of the production that Ezra was able to give them, and then some over the next couple of years. Moving into the final trade of the deadline, a trade that I really liked for both sides, but mostly for Minnesota. So Minnesota traded a 2024 sixth round pick to Arizona for Josh Dobbs and a 2024 seventh rounder. And this is really on the heels of, and no pun intended, but Kirk Cousins tearing his Achilles this previous week for the Vikings. And this was more or less Minnesota's attempt to keep their season afloat as they had really started to hit a hot streak, right? So they acquire Josh Dobbs from the Cardinals. Dobbs has started in every game for Arizona so far this season in place of an injured Kyler Murray. He's thrown for 1,569 yards for 196.1 yards per game. He has a 62.8% completion rate. He has 8 touchdowns so far through the air and an admirable 81.2 QBR. He also has 250 run yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. So Josh Dobbs gives the Minnesota offense a wrinkle that they didn't previously have, right? Because Kirk Cousins is not a mobile quarterback whatsoever. So Josh Dobbs comes in and he immediately gives the Vikings a piece that they can maybe be more versatile on the offense with. I am not in any way saying that he is going to play better than Kirk Cousins was. Kirk Cousins was having a really good season prior to the injury, despite the fact that Minnesota does not have as many dubs in the win column as you would like to have seen. He was on pace to have a great season, even after losing Justin Jefferson. Jordan Addison stepped up. TJ Hawkinson was playing well. So Kirk Cousins was having a pretty good season. And then he tore his Achilles. He's now out for the rest of the year. Aaron Rodgers has reached out about the Achilles recovery. Like, it's a whole thing. So Josh Dobbs is able to come in now and play his style of ball and give Minnesota that chance at continuing this, what is a hot streak, and potentially making some noise in the NFC despite not being a seasoned starter. Right? He's very much a journeyman quarterback. He's like a poor man's Ryan Fitzpatrick almost. But it is going to be an incredibly fun ride to watch with Dobbs in Minnesota once he figures out the playbook. He was an immediate success, and I say success pretty lightly, but he was an immediate success for Arizona. And on the flip side of this trade, Kyler Murray is coming back from his injury. It's looking like he's going to be starting in the next week or two. Arizona had already announced that Clayton Tune, the rookie quarterback that they have, was going to start over Dobbs, which, probably was on the heels of them knowing that they were going to trade Dobbs at the deadline. But Dobbs is on an expiring contract. He probably wasn't going to be part of the future with Clayton Tune on the roster and Kyler Murray coming back. Kyler's got that massive extension. He's going to be here for a couple more years. So the Cardinals made a really good move flipping a veteran quarterback for draft capital when the quarterback was on an expiring contract and he wasn't going to be on the team in the immediate future anyways. So despite the success that Dobbs has had in Arizona, all that did was allow Arizona to get actual compensation for him instead of, just letting him go back into free agency, not getting anything at all for him. So this was a win by both sides. I like this move for Minnesota because Dobbs really has played incredibly well this season. He's taken a step back in the last couple of weeks, but Minnesota also has much better skill players than Arizona does. Arizona's a little more banged up. Minnesota has a better offensive line. Minnesota has an equal defense, I would say, give or take. I mean, any given Sunday, right? But Minnesota has a better team. So Josh Dobbs is going from playing admirably well in a bad situation to being able to learn an offense and play in a better situation. So maybe we see the best Joshua Dobbs that we've seen in the NFL so far. And it would be really, really cool if Josh Dobbs was able to lead them somewhere in the postseason. I'm not saying that they're going to win a Super Bowl. I don't think that that's even remotely possible with as good as the Eagles and the 49ers are in the NFC. Not to forget to mention, Dallas is playing really well and Seattle is playing really well. And there are so many players in the NFC that are good, right, in this postseason hunt. But it's going to be fun watching what Josh Dobbs is able to do with this Minnesota offense. Cam Akers was able to get something going finally this last week. Alexander Madison is good. Joshua Addison has really stepped up. Nope. Jordan Addison has really stepped up. TJ Hawkinson has looked good. So this is a Minnesota team that can really surprise some people. And I think Josh Dobbs can really surprise some people and, possibly play incredibly well in Minnesota. So this is it. This is it for the trade deadline talk. These were all the trades that happened right there at the deadline. Was it as an exciting of a day as it usually is? Yeah, the trade deadline usually disappoints. I get really hyped up every season and it doesn't normally go great. However, I like a lot of the moves that were made. I think Philadelphia was the clear-cut winner of the trade deadline. I think the San Francisco 49ers are 1B straight behind them. I think Detroit made a good move. And all in all, I think that teams got better because of today. So with that being said, I am signing off. This is the end of the deadline show. I hope that you like it. If you have any comments or if you have any comments about the show, feel free to reach out to me on any of my socials. I love hearing feedback from the fans. This was definitely a one-off. It's a little different from what I'm used to putting out. So these shows will improve as time goes on. This is my first year running this show, so it can only get better from here. I love each and every one of the people that tune in every week and listen to my show. Thank y'all so much. We are well over 200 downloads now. We are in 13 states and 2 different countries. And this show is climbing to heights that I didn't even remotely expect in the first year. So thank you all to my usual listeners. Thank you all to everybody tuning in that's new. And I will see you all in the next episode of The Coach's Quarters. I am out.